Frank Sinatra called Dean Martin at 3 a.m. What Dean did next defined their 40-year friendship. The phone rang at 3 in the morning. Dean Martin reached across the nightstand, his hand finding the receiver in the dark. He'd been asleep, but not deeply. Performers never sleep deeply. There's always a part of you waiting for something, some call, some crisis, some moment that demands you be awake. Hello. There was silence on the other end. Not empty silence, but the kind that's full of something. Breathing, hesitation, pain. Then Frank Sinatra's voice came through, and it was shaking. "Dean, I need you to come over, please." Dean sat up. He'd known Frank Sinatra for 15 years. He'd seen him confident, arrogant, commanding. He'd seen him perform for presidents and intimidate studio executives. He'd never heard fear in Frank's voice. Not like this. "I'm on my way." Dean didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't ask if it could wait until morning. He simply got dressed, walked to his car, and drove through the empty Los Angeles streets toward Frank's mansion in the hills. What he found when he arrived would define their friendship for the next 40 years, and it would reveal something about Frank Sinatra that the world never saw: the loneliness of a man who had everything and the desperate need for the one thing money couldn't buy. To understand what happened that night, in 1953, you need to understand who these two men were and how they came to know each other so deeply that a single phone call in the darkness could say everything without saying anything at all. Frank Sinatra was born Francis Albert Sinatra in Hoboken, New Jersey, in 1915. His parents were Italian immigrants. His father was a firefighter. His mother was a midwife and a political force in the neighborhood, a woman who believed her son could be anything he wanted if he fought hard enough. And Frank fought. From the beginning, he fought. He fought the poverty. He fought the prejudice against Italians. He fought for every stage, every microphone, every moment in front of an audience. By the 1940s, Frank had become the biggest star in America. Young women screamed when he sang. They fainted in the aisles. Frank Sinatra wasn't just a singer. He was a phenomenon. The voice, they called him. And for a while, that voice carried him to heights most performers never reach. He had movie contracts, radio shows, sold-out concerts. He married his childhood sweetheart, Nancy, and they had 3 children. From the outside, Frank Sinatra had everything. But by 1949, something started to go wrong. His voice began to fail. Years of performing without proper technique, combined with emotional exhaustion, had damaged his vocal cords. Concerts were canceled. Recording sessions became painful. And then the scandal erupted. Frank had fallen in love with Ava Gardner, one of the most beautiful women in Hollywood. He left Nancy for her. The press savaged him. They called him a homewrecker. The Catholic Church condemned him. His fans turned on him. And MGM, the studio that had made him a movie star, dropped him from their roster. By 1952, Frank Sinatra's career was over. His voice was gone. His marriage was destroyed. Ava had married him, but their relationship was volatile, explosive. They fought constantly. They'd separate, reconcile, separate again. Frank was drinking heavily. He was broke. He owed back taxes. He couldn't get work. The man who'd been the biggest star in America was now a cautionary tale, a has-been, yesterday's news. And in his mansion in the hills, alone at night, Frank Sinatra was terrified. Not of failure. He'd already failed. He was terrified of the silence, of being alone with himself, of the moment when the music stopped and there was nothing left but the reality of who he was and what he'd lost. Dean Martin had come from a different world, but he understood loneliness too. He was born Dino Paul Crocetti in Steubenville, Ohio, in 1917. His parents were also Italian immigrants. His father was a barber. Dine grew up speaking Italian at home, and he was shy, awkward with English when he started school. The other kids mocked him. He dropped out in the 10th grade. He worked in a steel mill. He dealt blackjack in illegal gambling houses. He boxed for money, taking punches from men twice his size just to earn a few dollars. But Dean could sing. He had a voice that was smooth and effortless, like whiskey and velvet. He started performing in clubs, taking the name Dean Martin because it sounded more American. He worked his way up through small venues, learning to handle drunk crowds, learning to joke between songs, learning how to make people feel comfortable. By 1946, he'd partnered with a young comedian named Jerry Lewis, and together they became one of the most successful acts in show business. Martin and Lewis, they made movies, they filled theaters, they revolutionized comedy. But by 1956, the partnership had soured. Jerry Lewis wanted control. He wanted to be the star. Dean felt diminished, reduced to the straight man, the handsome face that set up Jerry's jokes. They split, and everyone in Hollywood predicted Dean Martin would disappear. Jerry Lewis was the talent, they said. Dean Martin was just along for the ride. They were wrong. Dean launched a solo career that proved he was more than Jerry Lewis's sidekick. He recorded hit after hit. That's a more. Ain't that a kick in the head? Everybody loves somebody. He starred in films, he got his own television show, and unlike Frank, who fought and clawed for every scrap of respect, Dean made it look easy. He made it look like he didn't care, like he was just having a good time and success came along for the ride. But Dean cared. He cared deeply. He just didn't show it. That was Dean's armor. Coolness, detachment, the image of a man so relaxed that nothing could touch him. But underneath that image was someone who understood what it meant to be dismissed, underestimated, counted out. Frank and Dean met in the late 1940s, but they didn't become close until after Frank's career collapsed. They'd cross paths at clubs, at parties. They'd nod to each other, exchange pleasantries, but there was a distance. Frank was a star. Dean was still working his way up, and Frank didn't have time for people who couldn't do something for him. That changed in 1953. Frank was at his lowest point. He'd fought his way into a screen test for a film called From Here to Eternity. He wanted the role of Maggio, a scrappy soldier, so badly that he agreed to do it for almost no money. It was a dramatic role, a chance to prove he could act, not just sing. But even after he got the part, Frank was struggling. He was insecure about his acting. He was drinking too much, and Ava had left him again, this time moving to Europe, putting an ocean between them. One night, Frank was at a club in Los Angeles. Dean was performing. Frank sat in the back, watching. Dean's ease on stage, his effortless charisma, was everything Frank wasn't feeling. After the show, Frank approached him. "You make it look easy," Frank said. Dean smiled. "It's not easy. I just don't let them see me sweat." They talked for hours that night, about performing, about the pressure, about what it cost to be in front of people all the time. Frank talked about Ava, about how much he loved her, and how terrified he was that he'd lost her for good. Dean listened. He didn't judge. He didn't offer advice. He just listened. And for Frank, that was everything. Most people wanted something from him. They wanted favors, connections, a piece of his fame. Dean didn't want anything except to be present, to hear him, to see him. They became friends after that. Real friends. Not Hollywood friends who smiled for cameras and never spoke otherwise, but the kind of friends who called each other late at night, who showed up when it mattered, who understood each other's silences. By the late 1950s, Frank's career had roared back to life. He'd won an Oscar for From Here to Eternity. His voice had returned, stronger than before. He'd learned to sing differently, with more maturity, more pain, more depth. He was recording some of the greatest albums of his career. In the wee small hours, songs for swinging lovers. He was back on top, and this time, he wasn't alone. He'd formed a group, the Rat Pack. The press called them, though they called themselves the Clan. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop. They performed together in Las Vegas. They made movies together. They partied together. They were the coolest, most powerful clique in entertainment. But within that group, Frank and Dean had something different, something deeper. Frank was the leader. Everyone knew that. What Frank said went. He was the chairman of the board, the man who made the decisions, who demanded loyalty, who expected everyone to fall in line. And most of them did. Sammy worshipped Frank. Peter needed Frank's connections. Joey was along for the ride. But Dean didn't fall in line. Dean did what Dean wanted. And somehow, instead of resenting him for it, Frank loved him more. Because Dean was the only one who wasn't afraid of Frank. The only one who could tell him no. The only one who could walk away if he wanted to. And that made Dean the only one Frank could truly trust. In 1960, they were performing at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. The Rat Pack shows were legendary. Loose, wild, hilarious. Frank would sing. Dean would wander on stage with a drink. They'd crack jokes. They'd improvise. The audience loved it. But backstage, Frank was demanding perfection. He wanted every show to be sharp, every moment to land. He was yelling at the band, at the crew, at anyone who didn't meet his standards. Dean pulled him aside. "Frank, you're making everyone miserable." Frank turned on him. I'm trying to put on a good show. You're trying to control everything," Dean said calmly. "And you can't, so relax, have a drink, and let it be what it's going to be." Frank stared at him. Anyone else would have backed down. Frank's temper was legendary. But Dean just looked back, steady, unbothered, and after a long moment, Frank laughed. "You're the only son of a bitch who talks to me like that." "Someone has to," Dean said. That was their dynamic. Frank pushed. Dean pushed back. Frank needed control. Dean refused to be controlled. And somehow, that tension created a balance. Frank knew that Dean loved him, but Dean wouldn't be owned by him. And that made their friendship real. But there were cracks beneath the surface. Frank's personal life was still chaotic. He'd had a brief, disastrous marriage to Ava Gardner. They'd divorced in 1957, but Frank never really got over her. He'd date other women, beautiful actresses and models, but none of them were Ava. He'd call her sometimes, late at night, drunk, begging her to come back. She'd refuse, and Frank would spiral. Dean watched it happen. He'd see Frank at the peak of his success, performing for sold-out crowds, living in a mansion, surrounded by people. And then he'd see Frank alone, late at night, unable to sleep, unable to be by himself. Frank needed noise. He needed people around him constantly. Silence terrified him. Being alone terrified him. Because when Frank was alone, he had to confront the parts of himself he didn't want to see. The insecurity. The fear that no matter how successful he became, it would never be enough. The fear that the people who loved him would leave, just like Ava had left. Dean understood this about Frank. He saw it clearly, and he never judged him for it. But he also couldn't fix it. Nobody could fix it. Frank had to live with it, and most of the time he did. He stayed busy. He recorded albums, made movies, performed constantly. As long as there was noise, as long as there was action, Frank could keep moving forward. But some nights the noise wasn't enough. The call came on a Tuesday night in November 1963. Dean was at home with his wife, Jane. They'd been married for 8 years. Dean had 4 children from his first marriage and 3 more with Jane. Life was good, busy but good. He'd just finished filming a movie. He was tired. He'd gone to bed early, falling asleep to the sound of the television in the other room. When the phone rang, Jane stirred beside him. "Who's calling this late?" Dean reached for the phone. "Hello?" Silence. Then Frank's voice, barely above a whisper. "Dean, I need you to come over, please." Dean sat up immediately. The fear in Frank's voice was unmistakable. "What's wrong?" "Just come, please. I'm on my way." Dean hung up. Jane was awake now, concerned. "Is Frank okay?" "I don't know," Dean said, pulling on his clothes. "I'll call you when I know." He drove through the dark streets of Los Angeles, his mind racing. Frank sounded broken. Dean had heard Frank angry, frustrated, drunk, but never like this, never this fragile. Frank's mansion sat high in the hills, a sprawling estate with views of the city below. The gate was open. Dean drove up the winding driveway and parked near the front entrance. The house was dark except for a light in the living room. Dean walked to the door and knocked. No answer. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. He stepped inside. "Frank?" The living room was enormous, decorated in mid-century modern style. Sleek furniture, expensive art on the walls, a grand piano sat near the windows, and on the couch, slumped forward with his head in his hands, was Frank Sinatra. He looked up when Dean entered. His eyes were red. His face was pale. There was an empty bottle of Jack Daniels on the coffee table and a glass in his hand. "Hey, Polly," Frank said, his voice hoarse. Dean crossed the room and sat down beside him. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, waiting. Frank took a shaky breath. "She's not coming back, Dean. Ava. She's never coming back." Dean had heard this before. Frank and Ava had been divorced for 6 years, but Frank still talked about her like the wound was fresh. "Did you talk to her?" "I called her tonight. In Spain. She's with some bullfighter now. She laughed when I asked if she missed me." "She laughed, Dean." Frank's voice cracked. He set down his glass and covered his face with his hands. His shoulders shook. Dean had never seen Frank Sinatra cry. Not in all the years they'd known each other. Frank didn't cry. Frank got angry. Frank got drunk. But Frank didn't cry. Dean put a hand on Frank's shoulder. "It's okay, Frank." "No, it's not," Frank said, his voice muffled. "Nothing's okay. I've got everything, Dean. Everything. Money, success, people telling me I'm the greatest thing that ever happened. And I'm sitting here in this goddamn house, alone, and I can't breathe. I can't stand the silence. When it's quiet, all I hear is nothing, like I don't exist." Dean understood. He understood more than Frank knew. Dean had his own loneliness, his own fears, but Dean had learned to live with them. Frank never had. Frank ran from them. He filled his life with noise, with people, with constant motion, but eventually, the noise stopped, and when it did, Frank was left with himself, and that was the one thing he couldn't bear. "You're not alone, Frank," Dean said quietly. "I'm here." Frank looked at him, his eyes glistening. "Why? Why do you put up with me? I'm a mess. I'm selfish. I demand too much from people. Why do you keep showing up?" Dean thought about that. He could have said a lot of things. He could have said, "Because you're my friend." He could have said, "Because I care about you." But Dean had never been good with words like that. So instead, he said something simpler, something more honest. "Because when you called, I knew you needed me, and that's what friends do. They show up." Frank closed his eyes. A tear slid down his cheek. "I don't deserve you, Dean." "Probably not," Dean said with a small smile, "but you're stuck with me anyway." For a moment, they sat in silence, not the terrifying silence that Frank couldn't stand, but a different kind, a companionable silence, the kind that says, "You don't have to fill the space. I'm here. That's enough." Then Dean stood up and walked to the piano. He sat down on the bench and ran his fingers over the keys. "You know what we need?" Frank looked up. "What?" "Music." Dean started playing, softly at first, just a simple melody. Then he began to sing. Not one of his hits, not one of Frank's songs, just an old standard, something their parents might have sung. "By the light of the silvery moon." Frank watched him, surprised. Dean's voice filled the room, warm and easy, and slowly, almost unconsciously, Frank started to hum along. Then he sang a line, then another, and before long, the two of them were singing together, Frank's voice blending with Dean's, the melody wrapping around them like a blanket. They sang for hours that night, standards, ballads, songs they'd performed 1,000 times, songs they'd forgotten they knew. Dean played piano. Frank sat beside him on the bench. They didn't talk about Ava. They didn't talk about loneliness or fear or the silence that haunted Frank. They just sang, and for those hours, Frank wasn't alone. The music didn't stop, and the silence didn't come. When the sun started to rise, painting the sky pink and orange beyond the windows, Dean finally stopped playing. His fingers were tired. His voice was rough. Frank was leaning against the piano, his eyes half closed, a faint smile on his face. "Thanks, Dean," Frank said quietly. "Anytime, Pally." Dean stood to leave. Frank walked him to the door. At the threshold, Frank put a hand on Dean's arm. "I mean it. Thank you for coming, for not asking questions, for just being here." Dean nodded. "That's what friends do, Frank." He drove home as the city woke up around him. Jean was waiting, worried, but Dean just kissed her forehead and told her Frank was okay. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Some things were private. Some things were just between friends. The world never knew about that night. Frank never mentioned it publicly. Dean never told anyone, but it changed something between them. After that, their friendship had a depth that went beyond the Rat Pack, beyond the performances, beyond the image. Dean had seen Frank at his most vulnerable, and Frank knew that Dean wouldn't use it against him, wouldn't gossip about it, wouldn't hold it over his head. Dean had just shown up, and that was everything. Over the years, there would be other late-night calls, not many, but enough. Nights when Frank couldn't sleep, when the silence was too much, when he needed someone who understood, and Dean always answered. He'd drive over, or he'd stay on the phone, or sometimes he'd just say, "Turn on the TV, Frank. Watch a movie. I'll call you in the morning." And Frank would do it, and somehow, knowing Dean was out there, knowing he could call if he needed to, was enough to get him through the night. Their friendship lasted 40 years. They performed together, they made movies together, they raised their families in the same circles. There were arguments, of course. Frank's temper flared. Dean would walk away, but they always came back to each other. Because underneath everything, the fame, the egos, the public personas, there was a bond that nothing could break. The bond of two men who understood each other's darkness and chose to be each other's light. In 1987, Dean Martin's son, Dean Paul Martin, was killed in a plane crash. He was a pilot in the Air Force Reserve. His jet crashed into a mountain during a training exercise. Dean was devastated. He'd always been a private man, someone who kept his emotions close, but this broke him. He couldn't perform. He couldn't sing. The light went out of his eyes. Frank showed up at Dean's house the day after the funeral. Dean's family let him in. Frank found Dean sitting alone in his living room, staring at nothing. Frank sat down beside him. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat there. Then quietly he said, "I'm here, Dean, for as long as you need me." Dean didn't respond, but after a moment he reached over and gripped Frank's hand. They sat like that for hours, two old friends, holding on to each other in the darkness. Frank stayed close after that. He called Dean every day. He'd invite him to dinner, to shows, anywhere to get Dean out of the house, but Dean had retreated into himself. The grief was too much. He never fully recovered from losing his son. He stopped performing in 1991. He withdrew from public life. Frank tried to reach him, but Dean was unreachable now. He'd gone to a place where even Frank couldn't follow. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998. He was 82 years old. The world mourned him. Presidents issued statements. Newspapers ran tributes. Frank Sinatra, the greatest entertainer of the 20th century, was gone. Dean Martin had been ill for years by then. He rarely left his home, but when he heard about Frank's death, those close to him said he cried. Not the public tears of a performer, but the private tears of a man who'd lost his oldest friend. Someone asked him, years before Frank died, what he'd remember most about their friendship. Dean had thought for a long time. Then he said that we understood each other. We didn't have to explain ourselves, we just knew. Dean Martin died on December 25, 1995, 3 years before Frank. He was 78 years old. At his funeral, Frank Sinatra was too ill to attend, but he sent a message that was read aloud. It said simply, "Dean was my brother, not by blood but by choice, and I will miss him every day for the rest of my life." The story of Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin is often told as a story of stardom, of the Rat Pack, of cool swagger and effortless charisma. But beneath all of that was something deeper, a friendship forged not in the spotlight, but in the darkness, in the late-night phone calls, in the quiet moments when the music stopped and the silence threatened to swallow everything. Frank Sinatra had everything: fame, wealth, talent, power. But what he needed most was someone who would show up at 3 in the morning, no questions asked, someone who would sit with him in the silence and fill it with music, someone who saw him at his worst and loved him anyway. Dean Martin was that person, and for 40 years he never stopped being that person. That's not just a friendship, that's a bond that transcends fame and ego and time. It's two men understanding that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is simply to be there, to answer the phone, to drive through the night, to sit at a piano and sing until the sun comes up. Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, two legends, one friendship that mattered more than all the applause, all the records, all the fame combined. Because in the end, when the music stops and the crowds go home and you're left alone with yourself, what matters is knowing there's someone out there who will answer when you call, someone who will show up, someone who will stay. That's what Dean gave Frank, and that's what their friendship gave the world. A reminder that even legends need someone to lean on. Even the strongest voices need someone to sing with them in the dark. And sometimes, the most heroic thing you can do is simply show up for a friend who needs you.